Hello. Tonight, 5 motel night shift stories about guests who never really checked out. If you enjoy quiet stories like these, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Mine began with a brass key left on the desk. The motel was usually quiet after 2 in the morning. By then, the highway outside had thinned to the occasional truck, and the red vacancy sign reflected faintly across the wet parking lot. I had been working the night desk for almost 3 months, long enough to know which pipes knocked when the heat came on, and which rooms had doors that needed an extra pull before they latched. That was why I noticed the key. Room 12. It was lying on the counter beside the register. I stared at it because I had checked a man into room 12 less than 20 minutes earlier. He was maybe 60, traveling alone, carrying one small brown suitcase. Nothing about him had seemed unusual. I looked toward the hallway. The door to room 12 was still closed. I told myself he must have come back quietly and left the key without saying anything. Then the desk phone rang. When I picked it up, the display said, Room 12. The man on the other end spoke very softly. Could you tell me why someone is trying to get into my room? The Ashdown Lodge sat outside a small western Kansas town called Bellwether, far enough from the interstate that most people found us only when the chain motels near the exit were full. 28 rooms, 2 floors, and a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee, carpet cleaner, and the heater under the front window. It was February of 2011. Freezing rain had come in from the west after midnight. I was 33 then. I had taken the night job after a warehouse outside Dodge City cut half its staff. The hours were bad, but they suited the empty weeks after my divorce, when my daughter was with her mother in Oklahoma. The man in room 12 had arrived at 1:43. I remember the time because I had just printed the nightly occupancy report. He came through the front door with rain beaded across the shoulders of a dark wool coat. His suitcase was the old hard-sided kind, brown with brass corners worn almost smooth. He said his name was Leonard Pike. He paid cash. He didn't ask for the Wi-Fi password, didn't complain about the weather, and didn't seem interested in conversation. He just signed the registration card in careful block letters and asked for a room away from the ice machine. I gave him 12. It was on the first floor, halfway down the east hall. We still used brass keys then. The owner had talked about electronic locks for years, but never wanted to spend the money. I handed Leonard the key on its heavy green plastic tag. He thanked me, picked up his suitcase, and went down the hall. 20 minutes later, that key was back on my counter, and Leonard was on the phone telling me someone was trying to get inside his room. I asked whether he had heard the handle move. No, he said. The key. Twice, someone had put a key into the lock from the hallway. The first time it had turned part way and stopped against the deadbolt. The second time, whoever was outside had left the key in the lock for several seconds before pulling it back out. I looked again at the brass key on the counter. The green tag had a white 12 printed on both sides. Stay where you are, I told him. I picked up the key and went down the hall. The motel was quiet enough that I could hear the television in room 9, some late-night talk show. The carpet had darkened where guests tracked in moisture from the lobby, and the overhead lights gave everything the tired yellow color of old paper. Room 12 was closed. No one stood near it. I knocked. Leonard opened the door only as far as the security chain allowed. His coat was off now. He wore a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. Did you see him? He asked. I told him I hadn't seen anyone. Then I held up the key. His expression changed. Not dramatically. He simply looked at it longer than I expected. That's mine, he said. I thought so. He glanced over his shoulder toward the nightstand. No, he said. I mean, mine is right there. Through the gap in the door, I could see the other key. It was lying beside the telephone. Same green plastic tag, same white 12. I tried his key in the lock after he shut the door again. It worked. So did the one I had found on the desk. That should not have been possible. There were 2 keys for each room, but the spare keys were kept in a locked cabinet beneath the front counter. The owner was particular about that. If one went missing, he charged the guest $15 and complained about it for a week. I went back to the lobby and opened the spare cabinet. The hook for room 12 was empty. That gave me a reasonable explanation, at least for a minute. Maybe I had taken the spare by mistake when I checked Leonard in. Night work does strange things to attention, and I was willing to blame myself before I blamed anything else. I put the key I had found into the cabinet and locked it. Then I checked the registration card. Leonard Pike, room 12. One night. Cash. His handwriting was still there. I entered his name into the computer again, even though I was sure I had already done it. When I pulled up the occupancy screen, room 12 was listed as vacant. I stared at that for a while. The system was old and unreliable. It crashed if you printed too quickly, and room 26 sometimes showed 2 guests at once because of a database problem no one had fixed. So I entered Leonard again. Room 12 turned red on the screen, meaning occupied. I saved it. Then I made coffee. At 2:17, the phone rang again. Room 12. Leonard asked whether I had found the person with the key. I told him no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He tried again." I looked at the clock above the lobby door. 2:17. What happened? The same thing. Key went in, turned once, stopped. Did you look through the peephole? I did. And? Another pause. There was nobody there. That answer should have bothered me more than it did. Instead, I found myself thinking about the lock. Old brass cylinder, loose housing. Maybe a vibration in the door could make it sound as though something was entering the keyway. I told him I would come down and look. Before I left the desk, I checked the cabinet. The spare key to room 12 was gone. I checked my pockets. Nothing. Then I looked at the counter. The key was back beside the register. Same place as before. I had no memory of taking it out. I didn't go down the hall right away. I stood behind the desk with my hand resting on the counter and listened to the building. Heat clicking in the walls. Refrigerator humming in the breakfast room. Rain ticking lightly against the lobby glass. Nothing else. I picked up the key and examined it more carefully. The plastic tag was scratched near the top. A small crescent-shaped gouge ran through the white number. I went to room 12. Leonard opened the door wider this time. I asked to see his key. He handed it to me. It had the same crescent-shaped gouge. Not similar, the same. I put the 2 keys side by side on the dresser. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then Leonard touched the edge of one tag with his thumb. "I thought I was tired," he said. I asked what he meant. He sat on the edge of the bed. He told me he had been driving since Denver and had planned to stop near Garden City, but the freezing rain had slowed traffic. He remembered seeing our sign, pulling in, checking the time on the dashboard, and carrying his suitcase inside. That matched what I knew. Then he said something I didn't. He said he had already checked out once. I thought I had misheard him. Leonard looked embarrassed. the way someone looks when they know a sentence sounds wrong before they finish saying it. He said that after I gave him the room, he had unpacked his shaving kit and tried to sleep. A little while later, he woke, convinced it was morning. The light behind the curtains looked gray. His watch said 6:12. He got dressed, packed his suitcase, and walked to the lobby. He remembered placing his key on the counter. No one was there. He waited, called out once, then decided to leave because the room was paid in cash and he didn't need a receipt. He walked outside. His car was where he had left it. He put the suitcase in the trunk, sat behind the wheel, and started the engine. Then he looked up. He was parked in front of room 12, not outside the lobby. His suitcase was beside him on the passenger seat. His watch said 1:58. He thought he had fallen asleep in the car. So he came back inside, walked to room 12, and found the door unlocked. His key was on the nightstand. That was when he called me the first time. I asked him why he hadn't told me. He gave a small, tired shrug. Because I wanted you to tell me it was 2 a.m, and I was confused. I understood that better than I wanted to. I took one of the keys back to the desk. Leonard kept the other. This time I put mine in the cash drawer and locked it with a separate key I wore on my belt. Then I wrote the time on a yellow sticky note. 2:26. Under it, I wrote, Room 12 key in cash drawer. I stuck the note to the monitor. I checked the occupancy screen. Room 12 was vacant again. Leonard's registration card was still on the desk. I entered him for a third time. At 2:41, room 12 became vacant without me touching the computer. At 2:43, the registration card was gone. I searched the counter, the floor, the trash can, and the shelf under the printer. Nothing. The sticky note was still attached to the monitor. I unlocked the cash drawer. The key was gone. For the first time that night, I called someone. The day manager, Carla, lived 15 minutes away, but the roads were bad, and I didn't want her driving in. I asked instead if we had ever had trouble with room 12's lock or the reservation system. She sounded half asleep. Why? I told her I had a guest whose room kept showing vacant. She said the computer did strange things all the time. Then I mentioned the duplicate key. That woke her up. Duplicate how? I explained. There was a long silence. Then Carla asked me to look under the lowest shelf in the cabinet behind the desk. I had never noticed anything under it, except old tax folders. At the very back was a black composition notebook covered in dust. Carla told me not to read the whole thing. Just see if there's anything about 12. I asked what the notebook was. She said it had belonged to Marty Ellison, the previous night clerk. Marty had quit about a year before I started. I opened the notebook. Most of it was ordinary shift information. Complaints, broken lamps, guests who paid late, license plate numbers, a reminder to reset the coffee timer after daylight saving time. About halfway through, I found 3 pages with the number 12 circled at the top. The first entry was dated November 14th, 2007. Guest said someone tried key twice. Spare appeared on desk. The next line had been underlined. Occupancy clears itself after 2:17. A later entry said, do not take key from guest if he comes to desk before dawn. I read that line twice. I asked Carla what it meant. She said Marty had become obsessed with room 12 near the end of his time at the motel. He claimed guests occasionally complained about the lock, and he blamed the computer when their records disappeared. Carla thought he had been drinking on shift. Then she said, "There should be a name in there." I looked back at the page. Near the bottom, Marty had written, Leonard Pike. My mouth went dry. I asked Carla if she knew the name. She said she didn't. The entry was dated more than 3 years before the man down the hall had checked in. I turned to the next page. There were 2 more dates. March 2008, September 2009. Both had the same name, Leonard Pike. The notes weren't identical. On one night, Marty wrote that room 12 called at 2:17 and complained about a key in the lock. On another, Leonard came to the desk at 3:12, carrying a brown suitcase, and asked why his car would not leave the parking lot. The last note was short. He keeps trying to check out. I stayed on the phone with Carla. I asked whether Marty could have made the entries as a joke. She said, maybe. Then I asked if she had ever met Leonard Pike. Her answer came slowly. I don't know. That was worse than no. She told me there was an old wooden box in the office closet where the owner kept registration cards from years before the computer system. I found it beneath a stack of payroll records. The cards were bundled by year with rubber bands. I searched 2007. Leonard Pike, room 12. Cash. The signature looked exactly like the one I had watched him write less than an hour earlier. There was no checkout time. The 2008 bundle had another. So did 2009. Same name, same room, same careful block letters, same blank space where checkout should have been. I stopped looking after that. Carla told me to move him to another room. That sounded reasonable. It was the kind of instruction that turned the whole thing back into motel work. A broken room, a difficult guest, move him, document it, let the owner deal with it in the morning. I went to 12 and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I used the key I had taken from the spare cabinet. It had returned to its hook without me noticing. The door opened. The room was empty. Bedspread smooth. Bathroom dry. No suitcase. No shaving kit. No coat. It looked exactly as it had before I rented it. I checked the trash can. Empty. The heater was off. The room was cold. On the nightstand, the clock read 1:58. Every other clock in the motel said 3:11. I unplugged it. The display stayed lit. 1:58. I left the room. When I reached the lobby, Leonard was standing on the other side of the front doors. He was outside in the freezing rain. His brown suitcase sat beside him. He wasn't knocking. He was simply looking through the glass at me. I unlocked the door. He stepped inside. Water shone on his coat. I tried again, he said. I asked where he had been. Outside? For how long? He looked at his watch. I don't know. He said he had packed, walked out of room 12, left the key on the desk, and gone through the front doors. He made it as far as his car. He started the engine. Then the motel lights went out behind him. When they came back on, his car was gone. He turned around. The motel was still there, but every room door stood open. He could see the beds inside, all of them empty. He walked back toward the lobby. With each step, the building seemed farther away. Then he blinked. The doors were directly in front of him, and I was standing behind them. I didn't know what to say to that, so I asked to see his key. Leonard reached into his coat pocket. His hand came out empty. We both looked at the counter. The key to room 12 was lying beside the register. The crescent scratch was visible under the desk lamp. 3:12. Exactly the time Marty had written in the notebook, more than a year before I worked there. That was when I stopped trying to explain the night as a computer problem. I showed Leonard the notebook. He read the entries without speaking. When he reached his name, he sat down in one of the lobby chairs. For several minutes he stared at the wet parking lot. Then he asked me what year it was. I told him. He nodded once. "Good," he said. I asked what that meant. He rubbed both hands over his face. "I keep getting that part right." I felt a small pressure behind my ribs. Not panic. Something quieter. The feeling of realizing you have misunderstood the shape of a problem. Leonard told me the first time he remembered staying at the Ashdown Lodge was in 1996. He had been 45, driving home from Colorado after burying his older brother. He checked into room 12 during a snowstorm. He remembered sleeping badly. He remembered waking before dawn. And he remembered trying to check out. After that, his memory became uncertain. He had fragments, different cars, different coats, different weather, a clerk with a mustache, a woman behind the desk. Once a television in the lobby with the towers falling in New York. Once a newspaper about a presidential election. Once a Christmas tree beside the vending machine. Each time he believed he was on a normal trip until something in room 12 began to feel familiar. Each time he tried to leave, each time he eventually found himself back on the road with no clear memory of the motel. Years would pass normally for him. Then, on some other trip, the Ashdown sign would appear ahead of him. He would stop. He would check in. And room 12 would be available. I asked why he kept taking it. "I never remember until after you give me the key." That line has stayed with me. I looked at the old cards again. 1996 was in the box. So was 1999, 2001, 2004. There were more than Marty had recorded. Leonard Pike, room 12, cash, never a checkout time. I asked him what he thought would happen if he stayed until morning. He said he had tried. He would fall asleep. Then he would wake somewhere else, usually on the highway, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Once at home, his suitcase would be packed. The motel receipt, if he had one, would be gone. The only thing that remained consistent was that he could never remember actually leaving the property. I thought about the note in Marty's book. "Do not take key from guest if he comes to desk before dawn." I asked Leonard whether previous clerks had taken the key from him. "Always." "Every time?" He considered it, then nodded. "That's how you check out." It was such an ordinary sentence that for a moment neither of us noticed what it meant. The key. Every loop we knew about ended with the same action. Leonard came to the desk. He returned the key. The room became vacant. His registration disappeared. And whatever happened afterward put him back onto the road, carrying the memory only as a vague uneasiness. I picked up the room 12 key. Leonard watched me. Then I set it back down. "I'm not taking it." He looked confused. "If you leave it there, that counts." "Then don't leave it there." I pushed the key toward him. "Take it with you." The idea felt ridiculous. It also felt like the first thing that night we had not already found in someone else's notes. Leonard picked up the key. At 3:38, we walked together to the front door. He carried the suitcase. I carried Marty's notebook. The freezing rain had softened to mist. His car sat 3 spaces from the lobby, an older silver Buick with Colorado plates. We crossed the parking lot. Nothing changed. No lights went out. The motel did not move farther away. He opened the trunk and placed the suitcase inside. Then he stood by the driver's door. "What if I get to the highway and I'm back in 12? I told him I didn't know. "What if I don't remember this?" I didn't know that either. He looked at the brass key in his hand. I told him to keep it. The owner could charge him $15. Leonard laughed once. It was the first time I heard him do that. He got into the Buick. The engine started. I watched him back out slowly because of the ice. At the edge of the parking lot, he stopped. For a second, I thought the car had stalled. Then the driver's window lowered. Leonard held the room key up where I could see it. He put it in his coat pocket. The Buick turned onto the county road. Its taillights moved through the mist until they disappeared. I stood outside for another minute. Then I went back in. Room 12 still showed occupied on the computer. That had never happened before. Leonard Pike's registration card was on the counter. I wrote the time on it, 3:42. Under checkout, I left the line blank. At 7, Carla arrived. I showed her everything: the notebook, the old cards, the occupancy screen. She didn't laugh. The owner came in at 8:30 and said Marty had probably planted the old cards, and Leonard was some kind of con man. He couldn't explain what the con was. For the next 3 weeks, room 12 remained occupied in the computer. The software company deleted the reservation remotely. It returned the next morning. Leonard Pike, cash. Check-in time, 1:43, no checkout. Eventually, the owner told us to stop renting the room. He said it was easier than fighting the computer. The Ashdown Lodge closed in 2016 after a newer hotel opened by the interstate. By then, I had moved to Wichita and found daytime work. I never saw Leonard Pike again. I searched his name online more than once. There were too many men with that name to know which one was him. Part of me preferred that. A few years after the motel closed, Carla mailed me Marty's notebook. The owner had been cleaning out the office before the property was sold. There was one thing inside I had never seen. A loose registration card had been folded between 2 pages. It was newer than the others. The date was February 2011. Leonard Pike, room 12. Cash. Check-in, 1:43. The checkout line was still blank. But on the back of the card, in handwriting I recognized as Leonard's, there were 6 words. I kept the key. I made it home. I still have that card in a drawer. The motel is gone now. A farm supply store stands where the lobby used to be. But every February, on the night the freezing rain comes in from the west, I take the card out and look at the empty checkout line. I never fill it in. The south walkway at the Cumberland Pines Motor Lodge had 7 doors. I knew that because I cleaned all 7 every night. Room 201 started beside the stairwell. Room 207 sat at the far end, where the concrete walkway stopped against a cinder block wall painted the same dull cream as the rest of the building. At 3:14 one January morning, there were 8 doors. The last one had a brass number screwed into the wood. 208. I stood behind my housekeeping cart and counted again. 7 rooms had become 8 without the building getting any larger. Cumberland Pines stood outside a small West Virginia town called Redfern, about 20 miles from Beckley, and far enough into the hills that winter storms could close the county roads before anyone in Charleston knew they were bad. The motel had been built in the late 1960s. 2 long wings faced each other across a sloping parking lot, with a lobby and diner at the bottom near the road. I worked the overnight housekeeping shift there, from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. That sounds unusual until you know the kind of guests we had. Utility crews, truck drivers, snowplow operators, people working mines or road jobs who slept odd hours and sometimes checked out before sunrise. I stripped rooms after early departures, washed towels, restocked coffee, and handled small problems so the day housekeepers could start with a clean board. By the winter of 2007, I was 51, and the regular crews knew me as Marla Dean. I had been divorced for 9 years and lived alone outside town. My married daughter lived in North Carolina and called every Wednesday. I always answered. Years earlier, during an ice storm, I had driven past a man beside a disabled car with my daughter asleep in the back seat. I told myself somebody better equipped would stop. He was found the next morning in a drainage ditch. I never told anyone I had seen him. After that, I had trouble leaving people alone in bad weather. The night the 8th door appeared, freezing fog had settled over Redfern shortly after midnight. It coated the railings and stair treads with a thin skin of ice. The motel sign down by the road faded in and out behind the fog, and the pine trees above the north wing looked like dark smudges against the sky. We were almost full because a line crew from Ohio had stopped when the highway department closed a mountain pass. One of those men was staying in room 207. His name was Thomas Avery. He was 34, broad-shouldered, quiet, and carried a yellow survey case everywhere he went. He worked for the company that inspected utility right-of-way before new poles were set. He had checked in around 11 with 3 co-workers, but the others were in the north wing. Before 3, Thomas asked me for extra blankets, and then whether there had always been a room after his. "There isn't a room after yours," I told him. "You sure? I clean it every night." He nodded without looking convinced. About 20 minutes later, I took my cart upstairs. That was when I saw 208. The door looked older than the others. Not ancient, just older enough to be noticeable. The paint was a darker cream, and the metal kickplate had scratches along the bottom. A narrow strip of light showed beneath it. The strangest part was the distance. Room 207 was still where it belonged. The cinder block end wall should have been less than 4 feet beyond its doorframe. Instead, the walkway continued another 18 or 20 feet. There was room 208, then a short stretch of railing, and only then the wall. I looked over the rail. The parking lot below had not changed. Thomas's company truck was parked directly beneath us. Beyond it, I could see the edge of the building roof dropping away where the wing ended. From outside, there was no space for the section of walkway where I was standing. I backed up until I was beside room 206. The extra section remained. I moved forward again. Still there. A television murmured behind the door, low voices followed by occasional audience laughter. I told myself 208 was a storage room I had somehow failed to notice in 6 years. That explanation lasted until I looked at the housekeeping board clipped to my cart. The south wing ended at 207. I had written those room numbers myself at the beginning of the shift. I did not touch the door. Instead, I went downstairs and found Jerry Walsh at the front desk. Jerry was the night clerk. He had worked there longer than I had, and disliked anything that interrupted the quiet hours between 2 and 5. I asked him if there had ever been a room 208. He stopped sorting receipts. That was enough to tell me I had asked the right question. "Why?" he said. "Because there is one upstairs." Jerry looked toward the ceiling. Then he looked at the clock. 3:18. "Is the south stair light on?" I had not expected that. "Yes." "Turn it off." "What does that have to do with anything?" "Just turn it off." I asked again whether 208 had ever existed. Jerry rubbed one hand over his face. Not since I've been here. That was not the same as no. Before I could press him, Thomas came through the lobby door. He was carrying his yellow survey case. He looked pale and irritated rather than frightened. Can one of you come look at something? Jerry did not move. I asked what. Thomas opened the survey case and took out a compact laser distance meter. I thought I was getting turned around, he said. So I measured it. The south walkway, from the stairwell to the end wall, should have been 64 feet. He had measured it earlier because his work made him notice dimensions. At 3:16, it measured 82 feet 4 inches. Jerry stared at the meter. Thomas said, Your building grew 18 feet. Jerry told him the equipment was cold. Thomas gave him a look I had seen from tradesmen when someone blamed a tool instead of a problem. He walked outside. I followed. Jerry stayed behind the desk. At the bottom of the south stairs, Thomas measured the outside wall from the corner of the lobby to the far end of the wing. 64 feet, 1 inch. Then we climbed the stairs. The hallway was 82 feet again. The number 208 waited at the far end. Thomas stood very still. I knew I wasn't imagining it. He raised the meter and pointed it toward the wall beside the extra door. 18 feet, 3 inches from the edge of 207. He measured the width of the parking lot below. Normal. He measured the distance across the rail to the opposite wing. Normal. Only the south walkway had changed. I remembered Jerry's question. I went to the stairwell and flipped off the light above the landing. The walkway went dark, except for the room lamps and the yellow glow coming through 208's bottom edge. Nothing happened. Then the motel sign down by the road flickered off behind the fog. The light beneath 208 disappeared. The extra section of walkway was gone. I did not see it shrink. 1 second I was looking at a door. The next, I was looking at the familiar cinder block wall 4 feet beyond room 207. Thomas walked to the wall and put his hand against it. Solid concrete. He measured again. 64 feet. Neither of us spoke for a while. When we went back downstairs, Jerry had already made coffee. He poured 3 cups without asking. Then he told us what he knew. Cumberland Pines had once had a room 208. He had learned that from the previous owner, a man named Walter Beck. The south wing originally extended farther up the hill. In the winter of 1981, part of the slope shifted after weeks of freeze and thaw. The last room and a section of exterior walkway developed cracks. The owner closed that end of the wing and hired a contractor to remove it the following spring. 208 had been demolished. That sounded like an answer. It was not. I asked Jerry whether anyone had died there. He said no. No fire? No accident? No. Then why did you ask about the stair light? Jerry looked into his coffee. Because the extra room had appeared before. The first time he saw it was in 1994, during freezing fog after 3 a.m. The south stair light had been left on. Walter Beck told him to switch it off and wait for the roadside sign to cycle dark. When Jerry did, 208 disappeared. I asked how Walter knew. Jerry said, because of what happened in 81. The room had been empty the night Howard Bell disappeared from 207. He was a 50-year-old traveling salesman from Pennsylvania, driving south during a winter storm. Around 3, the night clerk saw him leave his room in socks and an undershirt and walk toward the end of the wing. A minute later, he heard Howard knock and say, "Sir, do you need help?" When the clerk stepped outside, Howard was standing in front of 208. That should have been possible then. The room still physically existed. But 208 was vacant. The clerk had cleaned it himself before midnight because a couple had left early. Howard opened the door. He leaned inside. Then he stepped through. The clerk called his name and reached the room less than 10 seconds later. It was empty. The bed was made, the bathroom dry, and there was no second exit. Howard never came back out. His shoes and coat remained in 207. His car stayed in the lot for 11 days. He was never found. When the hillside damage appeared later that winter, Walter closed the room and eventually removed it. Jerry said Walter believed demolition would end the problem. For 13 years it seemed to. Then the room returned. Thomas listened to all of this with his arms folded. When Jerry finished, he said the obvious thing. An old story doesn't make a hallway 18 feet longer. Jerry nodded. No, but you measured one. We went upstairs again at 4. The fog was thicker, the south stairlight was off, and 208 was gone. Thomas wanted to know whether the fog, the sign, or the stairlight controlled it. I told him we had learned enough. He smiled slightly. My supervisor says that when I stop measuring something, he knows it's dangerous. Then listen to your supervisor. He went inside. I returned to laundry. For the next 40 minutes, nothing happened. I folded towels while Jerry balanced his shift drawer. The motel sounded normal again. At 4:47, the south stairlight came on by itself. I saw it through the laundry room window. A pale square of light appeared on the wet pavement below the stairs. I went to the lobby. Jerry was already looking up. He swore he had not touched the switch. Then the roadside sign went dark. The south stairlight stayed on. Jerry whispered, "That's not how it works." The sign came back. Upstairs, a television started playing. The sound carried faintly through the ceiling. Audience laughter. Thomas's door opened. I saw him step onto the walkway. He was fully dressed now, boots on, coat zipped. He looked toward the far end. Then he looked down at me. "Marla." I went outside. "What?" He pointed. The extra walkway had returned. 208 was there. This time the door stood open. A warm yellow light filled the doorway. From where I stood below, I could see part of a bedspread and the corner of a wooden dresser. Nothing moved inside. Thomas raised the laser meter. I told him not to. He measured anyway. 82 feet. Then he frowned. He measured again. 86. The corridor was longer than before. I climbed the stairs. Jerry followed as far as the landing, but refused to step onto the walkway. Thomas walked backward toward 206, measuring every few steps. 87 feet, then 89, then 91. The extra section was growing without visibly moving, like a road in fog whose next mile marker keeps slipping farther away. Thomas lowered the meter. From inside 208, a man coughed. A small, ordinary cough. Then a voice said, "Excuse me." Thomas looked at me. The voice came again. "Is someone out there?" Jerry called from the stairs. "Don't answer." The voice sounded tired, older, not theatrical, not threatening. "Please," it said. "I can't find my shoes." Thomas took one step toward the open room. I grabbed his sleeve. He stopped. The voice said, "I just need help getting downstairs." That sentence reached someplace in me I had spent years keeping closed. A man beside a broken car. Ice on the road. My daughter asleep in the back seat. Me driving on. Thomas felt my grip tighten. "You know him?" he asked. "No." But I knew the request. I knew what it felt like to hear somebody asking for help and decide that someone else should handle it. The door to 208 remained open. The room beyond it looked perfectly ordinary. Brown bedspread, lamp on the nightstand, television glowing blue in the corner. A pair of dark trousers lay across the foot of the bed. No person was visible. Thomas called, "What's your name?" Jerry swore from the stairwell. For several seconds, nothing answered. Then the voice said, "Howard." Thomas stared at me. I told Howard to stay where he was. He answered, "I have been." That was the moment the old story stopped being a story. Jerry went downstairs to call Walter Beck, who was still alive and living with his son near Princeton. Thomas and I stayed on the walkway. We did not approach the door. We kept talking to Howard. His answers were strange in small ways. He said he had checked in because of snow. He said his Plymouth was parked outside. He asked whether the diner was still open. He thought it was January of 1981. When I told him the year, he did not argue. He simply went quiet. Then he asked how long it had been. I did not answer right away. 26 years, Thomas said. Howard made a sound that could have been a breath or a laugh. My wife is going to be furious. None of us knew what to say. Walter Beck came on the lobby phone downstairs. Jerry put him on speaker. Walter confirmed the old clerk's account. Then he told us one detail Jerry had never heard. The night Howard vanished, the clerk did not see him enter a normal room 208. Not exactly. Walter had read the clerk's written statement years later. The clerk said the walkway looked longer than usual. He said the end wall seemed farther away. He assumed fog and darkness were affecting his sense of distance. When Howard opened 208, the clerk could see a room inside, but he could also see the outside wall of the motel beyond it from the parking lot. Both things appeared to occupy the same space. That was why Walter had demolished the room. He thought the physical doorway gave whatever was happening a place to attach itself. Thomas asked Walter how Howard could still be inside if the room was gone. Walter said, "Maybe the room wasn't the part that stayed." The line went quiet after that. At 5:12, the motel sign flickered. The light inside 208 dimmed. Howard said, "Something's happening." Thomas moved forward. I stopped him again. Howard's voice became clearer. "I can see the walkway now." I asked whether he could see us. "No." "What do you see?" "The stairs." He paused. "They're a long way off." Thomas checked the meter. 112 feet. The stairs were only 64 feet from the real end wall. The extra corridor was stretching fast. I told Howard to walk toward our voices. He said he was trying. We heard footsteps inside the room. Slow, then closer. Thomas called out every few seconds. "Keep coming." The footsteps stopped. Howard said, "I'm back at the bed." He had walked toward us and returned to the same place. The room was looping him. Thomas stared at the open doorway. "I can measure a straight line," he said. "Maybe if I give him a fixed distance." He set the laser meter on the railing and aimed it into the room. The display flashed. No reading. He stepped closer. Still nothing. Then, without warning, the meter showed 18 feet, 2 inches. Exactly the length of the missing section that had first appeared. Thomas said, "That's the room." I asked what he meant. He pointed at the display. The distance isn't between us and the wall. It's between us and him. The corridor was not making the building longer. It was putting distance somewhere there should not be any. That was our mistake from the beginning. We had been measuring the motel. The motel was not changing. The separation was. Thomas took the end of a 50-foot fiberglass survey tape from his case. He tied one end around the railing beside room 207. The other end had a metal loop. He told Howard he was going to slide it across the floor. Jerry shouted from below that it was a bad idea. Thomas ignored him. He fed the tape toward the open door. It crossed the threshold. 10 feet. 20. 30. The tape should have been running into the far wall of the room. Instead, it kept going. At 48 feet, it stopped. The line tightened. Someone had taken the other end. Thomas looked at me. Howard said, "I have it." His voice sounded farther away than before. Thomas wrapped the tape around his forearm. "Follow it." Howard began walking. The tape slackened, tightened, then slackened again. We could hear his shoes on carpet, then on concrete. For the first time, a shape appeared in the doorway. Not a shadow. A man. White undershirt, dark pants, bare feet. He looked about 50. He held the survey tape in one hand. He stood just inside the room and stared at us. I remember thinking how ordinary he looked. That was worse in its own way. He took one step forward. The motel sign went dark. The doorway shifted farther away. Howard was suddenly 20 feet deeper inside. The survey tape snapped tight. Thomas stumbled forward. I caught the back of his coat. He regained his footing, but his right boot had crossed the invisible point where the real walkway ended. For 1 second, the concrete beneath that boot looked darker than the rest. Then it was not concrete at all. It was patterned motel carpet. Thomas froze. "Pull me back." I did. He did not move. It felt as if something heavy had taken hold of the survey tape, and him with it. Jerry ran up the stairs and grabbed my belt. We pulled together. Thomas came back 6 inches. The carpet under his boot turned to concrete again. Howard shouted from inside the room. The tape was still in his hand. If Thomas let go, Howard would lose the only fixed line we had found. If Thomas kept holding it, the corridor was pulling him toward the doorway. That was the choice. I could have told Thomas to drop the tape. A sensible person probably would have. The old guilt in me wanted the opposite. It wanted me to save everyone, because I had once driven past one stranger in a storm. But guilt is not the same thing as judgment. I understood that standing there with Jerry braced behind me and Thomas half a step from a place that did not fit inside the building. I looked at Howard. He had been trapped for 26 years. Thomas had been there 20 minutes. I could not trade one man for another just because the first had been waiting longer. I told Thomas to let go. Howard heard me. He did not beg. He looked down at the tape in his hand. Then he nodded once. "Probably right," he said. Thomas released it. The fiberglass line snapped across the floor and vanished into 208. The doors slammed shut without making much noise, just a soft click from the latch. The motel sign came back on. The extra walkway disappeared. Thomas fell backward into Jerry and me. We ended up sitting against the railing outside room 206. The cinder block wall stood where it always had. Room 207 was the final door. No 208. No survey tape. At 5:30, the fog began lifting. Thomas packed his bag. He did not wait for the road crew. He told Jerry to charge the company for the extra night if he had to. Then he stopped. His face changed. "My meter." We went back upstairs. The laser meter was lying beside the railing. The fiberglass tape case was gone. Thomas opened the battery cover of the meter and stared at the screen. It displayed a stored measurement, 18 feet, 2 inches. He tried to clear it. The number returned. He turned the meter off. The display stayed lit. 18 feet, 2 inches. He removed the batteries. The display went dark. When he put them back, the same measurement returned. He placed the meter in his yellow case and closed it. Thomas left at 6:15 after the highway reopened. He checked out normally. Jerry gave him the printed receipt. I watched his truck reach the road and turn east. He called the motel 3 days later. I happened to answer. He had taken the laser meter to his company's equipment shop. They reset it, replaced the batteries, and finally replaced the circuit board. The first measurement it stored afterward was 18 feet, 2 inches. Thomas threw it away. He never stayed at Cumberland Pines again. Walter Beck died the following summer. I later found a January 1981 newspaper article about Howard. Search dogs had followed his scent from 207 to the end of the South Walkway. Then the trail stopped. There was no mention of 208. The motel changed owners in 2010. The new owners remodeled the south wing and enclosed the stairs. They also replaced the old roadside sign with a bright LED board that never cycled fully dark. After that, the extra room did not appear again while I worked there. I stayed until 2013. By then, my daughter had 2 children, and I wanted daylight hours. I never told her about the man I drove past years earlier. I did tell her something else. One Wednesday evening, she complained that she had been sitting with a coworker whose car had broken down in freezing rain. She was tired. The tow truck was late. She wanted to go home. I told her to stay until the truck arrived. She laughed and said, "Mom, I'm not going to abandon her." I said I knew. Then I sat at my kitchen table until she called again to tell me they were safe. Cumberland Pines closed in 2021 after years of declining business. The buildings were demolished the next spring. I drove past the property once after that. Only the asphalt remained, cracked through with weeds. The hill behind the old south wing had been cut back for a drainage project. There was no stairwell, no railing, no cinder block wall. Nothing left that could reasonably hold a room. I parked across the road for a minute. It was January. Freezing fog covered the hill. 7 pale rectangles of light appeared in a line above the empty parking lot. Then an 8th came on. The first time I saw the red scarf, it was draped over the lid of an industrial washer in a room that smelled of bleach and hot dust. I picked it up because guests were always leaving things in the laundry room. Sunglasses, socks, a child's stuffed animal once. I had already started toward the front desk when a woman spoke behind me. "You forgot me again." I turned around. She was standing in the doorway in a gray blouse and dark slacks, watching the scarf in my hand. I knew her face. I also knew, with equal certainty, that I had never seen her before. The Desert Lantern Motor Court sat 12 miles north of Deming, New Mexico, where the old state highway ran almost straight through scrubland before joining the interstate. It wasn't the kind of place anyone planned a vacation around. 36 rooms, a narrow pool that turned green every August, 2 vending machines under a metal awning, and a lobby with enough sun damage that the carpet near the windows had faded almost white. I worked the overnight maintenance shift there in the fall of 2014. My job was a little of everything. I changed air conditioner filters, reset breakers, fixed toilets, folded towels, and covered the desk when the night auditor went outside for a cigarette. The owner, Mr. Reeves, liked having one person awake who knew where the shut-off valves were. I was 46 and recently separated. My daughter Elena had started college in Albuquerque that August. She called me every Sunday for the first few weeks, and I managed to miss most of those calls. I told myself it was the schedule. Usually it was pride. The woman in the laundry room held out one hand. "May I have that back?" I gave her the scarf. Up close, it was a brighter red than I had thought. Thin cotton, worn soft at the edges. She wrapped it once around her neck. "I'm Mara Bell," she said. "Room 27. I repeated the name because it seemed polite. Mara Bell, 27. She nodded. Then she asked whether the air conditioner in her room was finished. That caught me off guard. I asked what she meant. "You were there about an hour ago." I told her she had me confused with someone else. There was no other maintenance worker on duty. She looked tired rather than annoyed. "You changed the filter," she said. "Then you said the fan motor sounded dry, but it would last until morning." That was exactly the kind of thing I would have said. I went to the small clipboard hanging beside the laundry room door. We logged every maintenance call by room number because Mr. Reeves tracked supplies down to the last light bulb. The last line was in my handwriting. Room 27, air conditioner humming, changed filter. Guest asked to keep window closed because of moths. The time beside it was 12:48. It was 1:56. I read the line twice. I remembered changing the filter. I remembered kneeling in front of an air conditioner with a flashlight between my teeth. I remembered a red scarf hanging over the back of a chair. What I did not remember was the woman who owned it. Night work gives you strange gaps. Anyone who has done it long enough knows that. You can walk to a supply closet and forget what you came for. You can sign a receipt and have no memory of touching the pen. I decided that was all it was. I told Mara I would check the unit again. She smiled, without much humor. "You said that last time, too." Room 27 was at the far end of the east wing, facing the desert instead of the parking lot. The motel had been built in stages, and that wing was older than the rest. The concrete walkway dipped near room 25, and the porch lights attracted small tan moths that gathered around the fixtures after dark. Mara unlocked 27 with a plastic keycard. The room looked ordinary. One queen bed, a green upholstered chair, a suitcase on the luggage rack, 2 paper cups beside the sink. The television was tuned to a weather channel with the sound turned off. Her red scarf went back over the chair. I removed the front panel from the air conditioner. The filter was clean. It was the same new filter I had logged an hour earlier. I even recognized the small tear near the cardboard edge where I had pulled too hard opening the package. I checked the fan motor and found nothing wrong beyond the usual vibration. Mara sat on the edge of the bed and watched me work. "Do you remember me now?" she asked. I said I did. She asked what her name was. "Mara Bell." "And my room?" 27. She nodded. Then she took a white index card from her purse and handed it to me. It said, in blue ink, "My name is Mara Bell. I am staying in room 27. If you forget me, read this before you do anything else." I almost laughed. I didn't because she looked serious. I asked whether she had a medical condition. "No." "Are you traveling with somebody?" No. Do you need a doctor? She shook her head. What I need is to check out. I looked around the room. Her suitcase was open, but mostly packed. I told her checkout wasn't until 11 in the morning. I know. You can leave early if you want. I've been trying. She said it quietly. There was nothing in her tone that suggested a joke. I asked how long she had been at the motel. She looked toward the curtains. I think 3 nights. That made no sense. Housekeeping would have serviced the room. The desk would have her registration. I would have seen her car. I went back to the front office. The night auditor, Curtis, was sitting at the desk eating sunflower seeds from a paper cup. He was 28 and could watch baseball highlights on his phone for hours without seeming to blink. I asked who was in 27. He checked the computer. Woman from Phoenix. What's her name? Curtis read the screen. Then he frowned. The name field was blank. The room showed occupied. 2 nights paid in advance on a credit card. No guest name. That's weird, he said. I asked if he remembered checking her in. He looked toward the east wing through the lobby glass. Maybe. What does she look like? He shrugged. Middle-aged? I held up the index card. Mara Bell, room 27. Curtis read it. Oh, right. Red scarf. He snapped his fingers once. I talked to her earlier. She asked where the ice machine was. That was enough for me. 2 tired employees, a bad reservation system, nothing more. I put the card in my shirt pocket. 10 minutes later, Curtis asked why I had written the woman's name on an index card. I stared at him. You just told me you remembered her. Who? Mara Bell. He gave me the same uncertain look I must have given her in the laundry room. I took the card from my pocket. He read it again. I tested the problem, because testing it was easier than accepting it. I spoke with Mara in room 27, then walked to the vending machines without reading the card. By the time I bought a bottle of water, I remembered that someone needed help, but could not picture her face. I read the card in my pocket. Mara Bell, room 27. Her face returned. I tried again on the way to the linen closet. The same thing happened. So I wrote Mara on the inside of my wrist and went back to her room. She saw the marker and nodded. That works for a while. Then she opened the nightstand drawer. Inside were 9 index cards in several kinds of handwriting. Mara Bell, room 27. Don't forget the woman with the red scarf. If she asks to check out, stay with her until she reaches her car. One of the cards had Curtis's name at the bottom. He did not remember writing it. She said she had started collecting them sometime during the second night. The first clerk who forgot her had been a woman named Denise. Mara went to the desk to ask for an extra blanket. Denise spoke to her, handed her the blanket, then answered a phone call. When she looked back, she asked Mara whether she needed a room. Mara thought Denise was joking. It happened again the next morning with a housekeeper, then with Curtis, then with me. The pattern was simple enough to describe. As long as someone could see Mara, they remembered her normally. Once she was out of sight, the memory began to thin. Small details disappeared first. Her voice, her clothes, the exact shape of her face. Within several minutes, most people remembered only that they had been doing something unfinished. Written reminders brought the memory back, but only while the reminder stayed in mind. I asked what happened if she left the motel. I don't know, she said. That surprised me. She had tried to leave twice. The first time she carried her suitcase to the front desk and asked to check out. Curtis printed something, then turned around to answer the phone. When he turned back, He asked why there was a suitcase in the lobby. The second time, she walked directly to her car without stopping at the desk. A couple from room 26 was outside loading their truck. Mara asked the man to watch her leave so someone would remember. He agreed. She drove to the end of the lot. Then she looked in the rearview mirror. The man was no longer watching her. He had gone back to his truck. Mara stopped before reaching the highway. She sat there for several minutes. Then she drove back to room 27. "Why?" I asked. She looked down at her hands. "Because I didn't know what would happen if nobody remembered I had left." That may sound irrational. At 2 in the morning, sitting across from a woman I had already forgotten several times, it did not sound irrational at all. We decided to speak with the couple in 26. Their names were Frank and Louise Heller, retirees from Iowa on their way to visit a son in Arizona. Frank answered the door, wearing a white undershirt and reading glasses. I asked whether he remembered talking to a woman in the parking lot earlier. He said no. Mara stepped forward from behind me. Frank's face changed. "Oh," he said. "Yes, you." He remembered immediately. Louise came to the door and recognized Mara, too. She said they had talked for almost 10 minutes beside the truck. Mara had told them she was going to Santa Fe. Louise had even written the name of a restaurant on a receipt for her sister. Then Mara stepped around the corner, out of sight. I kept talking to the Hellers. 30 seconds later, Frank asked why I was standing outside their room at 2:30 in the morning. I asked about the woman they had just described. Neither of them knew who I meant. Louise looked annoyed until she noticed the receipt on the dresser behind her. She picked it up. On the back, in her own handwriting, were the words, "Mara Bell, sister, in Santa Fe." Louise read the line twice. Then she looked past me toward the empty walkway. "I remember her," she said. Her voice had gone quieter. That was our external proof, if proof is the right word. 4 people had the same failure of memory. The failure stopped when Mara was visible. Written words could restore it, temporarily, and the effect seemed to begin only after she checked in to room 27. I told Curtis to call Mr. Reeves. He refused at first, because it was after 2:30. I reminded him that we had an occupied room, with no guest name, and a woman who could not safely leave the property, because nobody could remember her. That sentence finally got him to pick up the phone. Mr. Reeves arrived 25 minutes later. We showed him Mara's Arizona driver's license and the notes we had taped to the desk. He spoke with her for several minutes, then stepped into the bathroom to inspect the smoke detector. When he came back out, he looked at Mara and asked if she was traveling with me. I showed him the paper with her name. Recognition returned. His first theory was carbon monoxide. I wanted him to be right. We tested room 27, the hallway, the laundry room, and the lobby with the meter from the maintenance shop. Every reading was clean. Mr. Reeves stopped arguing after that. Whatever was happening was selective in a way bad air could not explain. Mara used the lobby phone to call her sister in Santa Fe. At first, she sounded relieved. Then she became quiet. "She doesn't know who I am," Mara said. She gave her full name, their mother's name, the street where they grew up, and a story about breaking a kitchen window as teenagers. Her sister remembered every story. She just remembered them without Mara in them. That changed the problem. People were not only forgetting recent conversations, older memories were losing the place where Mara belonged. She showed me a small address book. Earlier that day, she had called a coworker, a neighbor, and a cousin. None recognized her. The coworker remembered the empty desk beside hers. The neighbor remembered feeding someone's cat while that person traveled, but not whose cat it had been. Mr. Reeves suggested the police. Mara shook her head. She had already spoken to an officer that afternoon. An hour later, she saw him at the gas station across the road, and he did not recognize her. I asked how she remembered herself. Mostly, she said. Her license told her name and address. She remembered buying a blue couch, but not sitting on it. She remembered her sister's wedding, but not where she had stood. The forgetting was beginning to reach her, too. At 4:10, I went to the maintenance shop for a roll of fluorescent tape. I wanted something more visible than marker ink. The shop was behind the laundry room, a narrow space filled with plumbing parts, old thermostats, paint cans, and tools I had inherited from people who worked there before me. I opened the top drawer of my workbench. Under a box of wire nuts was a laminated index card. I do not know how long it had been there. The writing was mine. Mara Bell, room 27. If she comes back, do not let her leave alone. Below that was a date, March 8th, 2014, 6 months earlier. I sat down on the metal stool. There was one more line on the card, call Elena before sunrise. For several seconds, I could hear only the buzz of the fluorescent light above the bench. I had met Mara before. Not only that night, months before. I had known enough to laminate a warning and hide it in my own tool drawer. And I had forgotten every part of it. I carried the card back to the lobby. Mara read it. Her face changed before she said anything. You were here, I said. She nodded slowly. I thought so. You remember March? Pieces. She remembered a cold night, different car, same room. She remembered a maintenance man helping her carry a suitcase. She remembered talking about daughters. Then she looked at my wrist, where her name was written in black marker. I think that was you. I asked why she had come back. She said she had not meant to. She was driving north when she became tired. The Desert Lantern sign appeared ahead. The place felt familiar, but she could not remember why. She stopped. Room 27 was available. Mr. Reeves checked old credit card batches after that. There was no Mara Bell in March. But there was a charge with no cardholder name attached to it. 2 nights. Room 27. That was all. I stared at the laminated card again. Call Elena before sunrise. I understood why I had written it, even though I could not remember writing it. Mara and I must have talked about my daughter. Maybe I had told her how easy it had become to let another Sunday pass because I did not know what to say. Maybe she had told me that being forgotten begins in smaller ways than people think. I cannot claim I remember the conversation. I only know what I did next. I called Elena. It was after 4:30 in the morning. She answered on the 4th ring, frightened because parents do not call college students at that hour with good news. I told her nothing was wrong. Then I apologized for missing her calls. She was silent for a while. Finally, she said, Dad, are you okay? I looked at Mara through the office window. She was standing beneath the lobby light with the red scarf around her neck. Yes, I said. I just needed you to hear me say your name. Elena laughed because she thought I was being strange. That was fine. I stayed on the phone with her for another 10 minutes. When I hung up, Mara was still there, and I still remembered her. We made a plan. Not a good plan, just one that had not been tried before. Mara would leave before sunrise. I would walk with her all the way to her car and keep her in sight until she reached the highway. Curtis would stand in the lobby window watching both of us. Mr. Reeves would remain at the desk with the registration screen open. We wrote Mara's name everywhere we could without turning the lobby into something absurd. We wrote Mara's name where we could not easily miss it, on my forearm, on Curtis's hand, on fluorescent tape across the desk. I signed a receipt by hand because the computer would not hold her name. Mara Bell, room 27, paid in full. Checkout time, 4:58 in the morning. For once, we completed the checkout before anyone had time to forget the guest. Mara folded the receipt into her purse, then tied one end of the red scarf around my wrist and kept the other end in her hand. "Something harder to ignore than ink," she said. We walked to her dark green Toyota. The desert air had cooled before dawn, and the parking lamps made pale circles on the asphalt. At the driver's door, I looked back. Curtis stood in the lobby window. Mr. Reeves was behind him. Mara untied the scarf from her own hand, then tightened it around my wrist. "You keep it." I asked what she would use if people forgot her again. She touched the receipt in her purse. "Maybe they won't." She drove toward the highway while I repeated her name under my breath. Mara Bell. At the edge of the lot, the brake lights glowed for a moment. Then the Toyota turned north. I watched until the taillights disappeared. When I looked down at the scarf on my wrist, I knew it belonged to someone. I could not remember who. I ran back to the lobby. Curtis was staring at the fluorescent tape. Mr. Reeves had the handwritten receipt in his hand. Neither of them could remember why we were standing there. I read the name. Mara Bell. The memory returned slowly. Not perfectly. I remembered her voice before I remembered her face. I remembered room 27 before I remembered the suitcase. Then I remembered the car turning onto the highway. Mr. Reeves entered the checkout into the computer without using a guest name. Room 27 changed from occupied to vacant. It stayed vacant. That was the only part of the night that behaved normally afterward. Mara never came back to the Desert Lantern while I worked there. I do not know whether she reached Santa Fe. I do not know whether her sister remembered her when she arrived. I tried calling the number from the lobby phone history a few days later, but the woman who answered said she did not know anyone named Mara Bell. I did not call again. The handwritten checkout receipt stayed in the office file cabinet. Mara Bell, room 27. When I showed it to Mr. Reeves months later, he remembered testing the room for carbon monoxide. He did not remember why we had tested it until he read her name. Mr. Reeves eventually replaced the computer at the front desk. The old system had too many blank reservations and duplicate charges. Room 27 never caused another problem that I knew about. I left the motel in 2017 when Elena finished school and moved to Las Cruces. I wanted to be closer to her. We are better now. Not perfect, but she calls, and I answer. The red scarf stayed with me. For years, I kept it in the glove compartment of my truck. Later, I tied it loosely around the base of the rearview mirror, where it faded from bright red to a dusty pink under the New Mexico sun. I also kept the laminated card from my tool drawer. Mara Bell, room 27. If she comes back, do not let her leave alone. Call Elena before sunrise. There are days when I read that card and the entire night returns clearly. There are other days when it feels like something written by a stranger who happened to use my handwriting. On those days, I look up at the scarf hanging from the mirror. Some mornings, I don't know why it's there. The old switchboard lit up after I disconnected the room. That is the part I still come back to. I had the cable pair for room 18 hanging loose in my hand. The copper ends were stripped, labeled, and physically separated from the terminal block. There was no path from that room to the motel's phone system anymore. Even so, Extension 18 began to ring. I put on my test headset and answered. A man said, very calmly, "Please don't transfer me again." The Black Spruce Motor Inn sat outside Presque Isle, Maine, on a road through potato fields and dark woods. It had 42 rooms and a lobby built around a stone fireplace no one used in summer. I worked for a communications company out of Bangor, installing and repairing business phone systems. The Black Spruce still had an analog private branch exchange from the early 1980s, large enough to fill a utility closet behind the front desk. The changeover had to happen at night, so I was disconnecting the guest room extensions in small groups and moving them to a new digital controller. I was 43 and had done that kind of work for 17 years. I trusted wiring diagrams. Every line begins somewhere. Every pair terminates somewhere. If a phone rings, there is supposed to be a circuit that explains why. The man on extension 18 was the first thing that night without one. I asked who was calling. There was a short pause. "Front desk?" "No. Telephone technician." Another pause. "Did she transfer me?" I asked who he meant. "The woman at the desk." The night clerk was a woman named Janice Frost. She was in her early 60s and had been working at the Black Spruce for more than 20 years. At that moment, she was 15 feet away in the lobby, balancing the cash drawer. I could see her through the open utility room door. She was not touching a phone. "No one transferred you," I said. "What room are you in?"
"I don't know anymore."
His voice was neither old nor young. Maybe 50, maybe younger and tired. There was a soft hiss behind him, the kind old telephone lines pick up when moisture gets into a junction box. Then he said, "Can you keep me here?" I asked what he meant by here. The line clicked. The call was gone. I looked at the loose copper pair in my hand. Room 18 remained disconnected. I stepped into the lobby and asked Janice whether anyone was staying there. She checked the rack beneath the counter. The Black Spruce used a computer for reservations by then, but Janice still kept paper room slips in a wooden organizer because she trusted paper more than software. 18 is empty, she said. Out of service? No, just empty. I told her about the call. She looked toward the utility closet. From 18? That's what the board showed. Janice did not laugh. That interested me more than if she had. I asked whether the old system misidentified extensions, not that I know of. Crossed pair somewhere? You're the phone man. She said it without sarcasm. I went to room 18. 18 was on the first floor of the west wing, between 17 and 19. The room was clean and dark. Janice used the master key and let me inside. The phone sat on the nightstand between the beds. I lifted the receiver. No dial tone. I checked the wall jack with my meter. Dead. No voltage and no continuity back to the equipment room, exactly as it should have been after I disconnected it. Janice watched from the doorway. "Anyone call the desk from here tonight?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not tonight." Something in the way she said it made me look up. "What about other nights?" She folded her arms. "Finish your work first." I smiled a little. "That sounds like there's a story." "It sounds like I need working phones by breakfast." She went back to the lobby. I returned to the switchboard and tried to reproduce the problem. I reconnected 18, dial tone. I called the front desk. Janice answered. I disconnected it again. Dead. Nothing unusual. At 1:30, I moved on to rooms 19 through 24. At 1:46, extension 21 rang. The display lamp on the old console blinked twice. I had just removed 21 from the terminal strip. I answered with the test headset. The same man said, "You moved me." I looked at the clock on my toolbox. 1:46. "I didn't transfer you." "You did something." "I disconnected a room." "I know." His voice had more static behind it now. I asked his name. He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Calvin." "Calvin what?" "I used to know." That sentence could have been frightening if he had delivered it dramatically. He did not. He sounded embarrassed. I asked where he was calling from. "I can see a bed." "What room number?" "There isn't one on the inside." "Go to the door and look." I tried. "What happens?" "I get another phone." I did not understand. Calvin continued before I could ask. "When I leave the room, I'm in another one. Different carpet, different picture, same phone." There was a click. For half a second line lit on the console. Extension 24. Then 21 went dark. 24 stayed lit. I answered it. Calvin said, "See?" I stood very still. Room 24 was not only disconnected, its wall jack had been removed that afternoon because the room was being repainted. I walked to the lobby without hanging up. Janice looked at me. I held one finger to my lips and put the headset against her ear. She listened. Calvin was saying, "Please keep the line open." Janice's face changed. Not much. Her eyes simply moved from me to the old switchboard. She gave the headset back. "Ask his last name." I did. Calvin said, "Rusk." Janice sat down. I asked if she knew him. She did not answer until the call moved again. 24 went dark. Extension 7 lit. Calvin's voice was still there. Janice said, "That's not possible." I told her we were well past that. She opened a drawer beneath the reservation desk and took out a ring of small brass keys. Not room keys. File cabinet keys. The cabinet stood in the office behind the lobby. It contained old tax records, maintenance invoices, and boxes of registration cards the owner had never thrown away. Janice found a cardboard box marked 1987. We searched together. It took less than 5 minutes. Calvin Rusk, room 31, 1 adult, weekly rate, paid cash. The card showed a check-in date in June. The checkout line was blank. I asked how long he had stayed. Janice ran one finger over the card. "I don't know." "You worked here then?" "No, I started in 83. That stopped me. "You were here?" She nodded. "I was housekeeping." "You remember him?" "No." Her answer came too quickly. I waited. Finally, she said, "I remember the name." The call had moved to extension 11. The light glowed steadily on the console beside us. Janice would not touch it. I asked what she remembered. Janice remembered Calvin as a quiet, traveling salesman who had stayed several weeks. Then one morning, his room, suitcase, and car were gone. Nobody thought much of it until the desk clerk noticed he had never paid the final week. The phone number on his registration card was disconnected, and the address belonged to someone else. The owner assumed Calvin had skipped the bill. Did he check out? No. So you just closed the room? Eventually. How? She looked at the old console. I don't know. I asked what she meant. In the computer now, you click a button. Back then we wrote things down. The desk clerk handled the room rack. Who was the clerk?
Elaine Mercer.
Can we call her? Janice shook her head. Elaine had moved to Florida years earlier. Janice had not spoken with her since the late 90s. I asked whether Calvin had ever called after disappearing. Janice stared at extension 11. Then she said,
Not from outside.
Then she told me about the phones. The first calls began a few nights after Calvin vanished. A room would ring the desk, and a man would ask to be connected to the front desk. When the clerk explained that he was already speaking to it, the man would say he had been transferred to the wrong room. Sometimes he gave Calvin's name. The calls faded, then returned during later renovations, after a lightning strike, and when several room phones were replaced. Always at night, always when wiring was being changed. Janice had heard the voice twice. She had never told the owner, because the owner's father had already made a rule about it. Do not transfer the call. Do not put it on hold. Do not ask the caller to dial another extension. If the call appears, keep him where he is until the line drops. I looked at her. You knew that, and you told me to finish my work?
I didn't know it was going to happen.
You could have mentioned the haunted phone system. She gave me a tired look.
I was hoping you would replace it before it remembered him.
That sentence stayed with me. The old system clicked. Extension 11 went dark. The next light was 31, Calvin's original room. I answered. Calvin?
I'm here.
Room 31?
I don't know.
Do you recognize the room? A long pause.
The picture.
What picture?
Farmhouse in winter.
Janice closed her eyes. She knew the print. The black spruce had used the same cheap framed art for years. Most rooms had landscapes. Room 31 once had a picture of a white farmhouse under snow. It had been removed during a remodel in 1998. I asked Calvin what year he thought it was. He said 1987. I asked the month.
June.
Outside the lobby windows, warm August rain moved across the parking lot. I told him the year. He did not speak for nearly 30 seconds. Then he said, "That explains the television." "What about it?" "It doesn't have knobs." The room televisions had been replaced with newer sets 2 years earlier. Calvin was not describing one time. He was seeing pieces of the motel as it changed. Each transfer put him into another version of a room. I still wanted a technical explanation. Old analog systems can create cross-connections, phantom ringing, and bad relay behavior. But none of those faults answer questions. I tested the outside trunks and the intercom bus. Calvin was not on either one. His voice existed only on the station side. As far as the equipment was concerned, the call was already inside the motel. At 2:30, I called my supervisor in Bangor. His name was Ross Dyer. He had hired me when I was 26. I told him I had an unidentified internal call migrating between disconnected extensions. He assumed I was describing a relay fault. I let him. I needed someone outside the building thinking mechanically. Ross told me to isolate the old controller, one bank at a time. "If the call survives a dead bank," he said, "you've mislabeled something." I shut down the guest room banks one at a time. Each time I killed the bank carrying Calvin, his call moved to another extension. When I shut down the final bank, every guest room circuit on the old system was without power. Extension 38 still glowed. Calvin said, "It's darker now." I stopped touching switches. Janice stood beside me. "What did you do?" "Turned off every room." "Turn them back on." I did, one bank at a time. The hallway lamps on the console returned.
Calvin's light moved to room 5. He sounded clearer.
I thought you left.
I'm here.
Don't do that again.
I won't. That was the moment I stopped treating him like a fault. I took a chair from the office and sat beside the console. For the next half hour, I kept Calvin talking, because he seemed calmer when someone stayed on the line.
He remembered selling irrigation equipment, driving a blue Oldsmobile, and a wife named Nancy. He remembered having a son, but could not recall the boy's first name. Every few minutes, his extension changed. 5, 14, 29, 3. I marked the sequence on a legal pad. Janice watched. After 12 moves, she noticed something.
They're not random.
I looked at the list. She was right. The rooms followed the physical order in which the motel had been renovated over the years. West wing first, then the east wing, then the rooms around the pool. Janice remembered because she had worked through every renovation. Calvin was moving through the history of the telephone wiring. Not through the rooms themselves. Every time a pair had been moved, spliced, renumbered, or reused, his call followed it. I pulled the old wiring binder from the bottom shelf. The pages had hand-drawn diagrams dating back to 1981. Several were mine from earlier that evening. Near the back was a faded sheet labeled Temporary Station Transfers, July 1987. There were 6 room numbers, 31 to 29, 29 to 14, 14 to 5, then a line to something marked Hold Loop B. I pointed it out to Janice. She stared at the page.
I remember that.
The West Wing had been renovated in the summer of 1987. Guests were moved between rooms as painters worked around them, and the desk clerk kept forwarding Calvin's extension from one room to the next. Then came the detail neither of us expected. At the bottom of the page, written in red pencil, were 4 words. Rusk. Do not release loop. I asked Janice what that meant. She did not know. I did. Older phone systems used holding circuits that could keep a call parked while a clerk moved it or connected another line. A stuck hold loop could tie up a circuit until someone manually released it. But not for 17 years. I opened the old cabinet. Near the bottom were 2 relay modules labeled Hold A and Hold B. Hold A clicked normally when I tested it. Hold B did nothing. Its indicator lamp was burned out. I removed the cover. The relay contacts inside were blackened with age. A thin strip of paper had been folded and pushed behind the mounting bracket. I pulled it free. It was not part of the phone system. It was a motel message slip. The date was July 28th, 1987. Room 31, Mr. Calvin Rusk. The message read, Call wife before checkout. Under that, in different handwriting, someone had written, Guest moved again. Keep call parked. I showed Janice. She sat down.
I wrote the first line.
I looked at her. You're sure? She nodded. She had been covering the desk while Elaine ate dinner. Calvin came through the lobby and asked whether any calls had come for him. Janice told him no. He said he needed to call his wife before he left. The desk phone rang before she could help him. Janice answered it. When she looked up, Calvin was gone. She assumed he had returned to his room. Later, Elaine took over. At some point, Calvin called the desk from whichever room he had been moved to and asked to be connected outside. Elaine parked his call while she dealt with another guest. Then there was a power interruption. A thunderstorm had knocked out one leg of the building service. The telephone system reset. Calvin disappeared,
that same night. His car was gone by morning. His final week was unpaid. No one connected the power failure to the call. I looked at the paper. Did anybody ever release Hold B? Janice did not answer. She did not need to. The label told me they had not. At 3:42, Calvin's call moved again. The Hold B relay made a small metallic sound. For the first time that night, I heard it click.
Calvin said, "I remember the desk." His voice had changed, not in pitch, in certainty. "What do you remember?" "A woman put me on hold." Janice looked down. "She said she'd be right back." Calvin continued. "I waited." The room around us was quiet enough that I could hear rain dripping from the lobby awning. "I waited a long time," he said. Janice leaned toward the headset. "My name is Janice." Calvin did not answer. She swallowed. "I was at the desk that night." Another silence. Then Calvin said, "You were younger." Janice covered her mouth with one hand. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For leaving you there." Calvin sounded genuinely confused. "You didn't." Janice looked at me. He said, "It was Elaine." That changed the story again. Janice had carried the guilt for the wrong moment. The note was hers. The abandoned call was not. Elaine had parked him. Elaine had written the red instruction. Janice had only started the message. I asked Calvin whether he remembered leaving the motel. "No."
Do you remember your car?
"Yes."
Do you remember getting into it?
"No." "Do you remember anything after the call?" "Rooms." Only rooms. Different wallpaper, different lamps, different televisions. Sometimes snow outside, sometimes sunlight, sometimes darkness. Always a phone. Always someone transferring him. That was when the pattern finally made sense. Calvin was not haunting the motel because he had died there. We had no evidence he had died at all. He was attached to an unfinished action, a call placed on hold and never released. Every renovation had given that call another route. Every rewiring had moved it. Every technician before me had unknowingly preserved the path. I was about to replace the final system capable of carrying it. That left a choice. If I powered down the old switchboard and removed it as planned, Hold B would finally die. Maybe Calvin would go with it.
Maybe that was release. Or maybe I would cut the only thing keeping him connected to anyone.
I asked Calvin what he wanted. He took a long time answering. "Can you get me outside?" I understood what he meant. Not outside the room, outside the motel telephone system. I told him I could try. The new digital controller had 2 unused outside trunks. I could bridge the old hold loop into one long enough to seize a public line. It was not how the equipment was designed to be used. Ross would have had several opinions. I did not call him. I built the connection manually. Hold B to an isolation transformer. Transformer to a test coupler. Coupler to the spare trunk. I checked voltage twice. Then I told Calvin I was going to move him one last time. He said, "Don't transfer me." "I'm not." "What are you doing?" "Opening a line." "To where?" "Anywhere but here." Janice stood beside the console. The rain had stopped. A pale strip of sky had begun to show beyond the parking lot. though sunrise was still more than an hour away. I closed the bridge. The old switchboard clicked. Every extension lamp went dark. For 1 second, I thought I had lost him. Then the spare, outside trunk lit on the new controller. I answered. Calvin was there. No static. No room number. Just his voice. You still with me? Yes. What do I do? I looked at the keypad. Dial. I don't know the number. Who did you want to call? Nancy? Do you remember her number? No. I asked whether he remembered the town. He gave me the name of a place outside Syracuse, New York. I tried directory assistance from my cell phone. There were several Rusks. No Nancy. 17 years had passed. Calvin listened while I searched. Finally, he said, "That's all right." I asked if there was anyone else. My son. Name? Another long silence. Then he laughed softly. I told you, I can't remember. The outside trunk stayed open. Dawn brightened the windows. I thought about spending the rest of the morning searching names. I would have done it if Calvin had asked. Instead, he said, "Can the front desk check me out?" Janice looked at me. She pulled the old registration card from the box. Calvin Rusk, room 31, checkout blank. She placed it on the counter. "What time?" she asked. I looked at the clock. 4:58. Janice wrote it. 4:58 in the morning. Then she said into the headset, "Mr. Rusk, you're checked out." Nothing dramatic happened. No lights flickered. No thunder. The line remained open. Calvin breathed out. "That's good." I asked whether he could see anything. "The road." "What road?" "The one out front." Janice went to the lobby window. The parking lot was empty except for my company van and her sedan. No blue Oldsmobile. No man walking. Calvin said, "I think my car's here." I did not tell him it wasn't. He thanked Janice. Then he thanked me. I asked where he was going. "Home, I hope." The line clicked once. The outside trunk went dark. Hold B, released. A small metal arm inside the old switchboard dropped for the first time since I had opened the cabinet. I could see a clean stripe beneath it, where dust had never settled. I waited 10 minutes. No extension rang. I completed the cutover. By 6:30, every guest room was on the new system. Janice tested calls from 5 rooms, all normal. I removed the old Hold B relay and set it on the floor with the scrap equipment. Then I changed my mind. I put it in my tool case. I told myself I wanted it because it was an interesting failure. That was partly true. The black spruce stayed open another 9 years. I returned twice for ordinary service calls, and the phones behaved normally. Janice retired in 2008. The property was sold a few years later. I never found Calvin Rusk. Years later, I found a Calvin J. Rusk, who had worked for an irrigation supplier in upstate New York during the 1980s. But nothing told me whether he was the same man. I found no obituary or missing person notice that clearly matched him. Nothing told me whether Calvin had driven away from Maine in 1987, or whether only his voice had. For a long time, I thought that uncertainty was the worst part. It wasn't. The worst part came from the relay. I kept it in a drawer in my garage after I retired. Black plastic housing, 8 metal pins, a faded label reading, "Hold B." Every few years I would take it out and remember that night. The relay could not work by itself.
It needed a coil voltage. It needed contacts. It needed a circuit. Without those things, it was just a piece of old hardware.
In August of 2021, almost 17 years after the black spruce job, I was sorting tools to give to my nephew. The relay was at the bottom of a box. When I picked it up, the armature inside moved. One small click. I stood there, holding it. Nothing else happened. I almost laughed. Metal contracts. Springs shift. Old parts move. Then it clicked again. 2 clicks. The same sound the switchboard used to make before Calvin's call changed rooms. I set it on the workbench. The garage was quiet. A minute passed. Then my phone rang inside the house. I did not hurry. By the time I reached the kitchen, the call had stopped. No number showed in the history. There was only a voicemail. I played it once. A man's voice said 4 words. You kept the line open. I still have the relay. It has never clicked again. The first thing that appeared was a black leather shoe. It was sitting in the middle of the covered walkway outside my room, polished enough to catch the weak yellow light above the door. There was nothing especially strange about a lost shoe at a motel. What bothered me was that I had stepped over the same empty patch of concrete less than a minute earlier. I picked it up and carried it toward the office. The night clerk looked at the shoe, then at me. Where did you find that? Outside 11. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he said, Put it back. The Harbor Light Motor Inn stood just north of a small town on the Oregon coast, a low horseshoe of rooms facing a parking lot that collected wind-blown needles from a row of shore pines. The ocean was on the other side of the highway. You couldn't see it from the property, but on quiet nights, you could hear the surf behind the traffic. I stayed there for 12 nights in April of 2012. I repaired commercial refrigeration systems, and a seafood processing plant down the road had scheduled a shutdown so we could replace 2 compressors without stopping production during the day. Our crew worked from 6 in the evening until 2 or 3 in the morning. The motel was cheap, close, and willing to let us sleep past normal housekeeping hours. I was 44 then, and better at fixing machines than I was at talking to my younger brother. Owen and I had not spoken in almost 3 years. After our mother died, we argued over what to do with her house. The argument itself lasted maybe 20 minutes. The silence after it lasted much longer. That part matters, although I didn't know it yet. The night clerk at the Harbor Light was a man named Dennis Cole. He was in his late 50s, thin, gray-haired, and always reading paperback westerns behind the counter. During my first week, our conversations rarely went beyond coffee and weather. That night was different. Dennis kept looking at the shoe in my hand. It was a man's dress shoe, black leather, size 10 or 11. The heel was worn down more on the outside edge, and there were small grains of pale sand stuck in the seam near the sole. I asked if it belonged to one of the guests. Dennis shook his head. Where exactly was it? Outside my door. Facing which way? I thought that was an odd question. Toe toward the parking lot. He closed his book. Put it back where you found it. I laughed because I thought he was making some kind of night shift joke. He didn't laugh with me. I asked why. Dennis looked through the office window toward room 11. Then he said, "Because it won't stay in here." That was not an explanation, but I was tired enough to accept it as one. I carried the shoe back. I put it exactly where I remembered finding it, toe pointed toward the lot, heel toward my door. Then I went inside and slept.
At noon, the shoe was gone. I assumed another guest had taken it to the office. That evening, I asked Dennis about it before leaving for work. He said no one had turned in a shoe. I forgot about it. The next night, I returned to the motel at 2:47. There was a white dress shirt folded on the concrete outside my room. It had been placed neatly enough that the sleeves lay across the chest. I stood there with my tool bag in one hand and stared at it. The shirt was dry, even though a light rain had been blowing across the lot for hours. I did not pick it up. I went to the office. Dennis was already watching me through the window. "What is it?" I asked.
He sighed and closed his book.
Shirt?
I nodded. He looked at the wall clock. 2:51.
Leave it.
I asked if this had happened before. Dennis said yes. Not often. Just enough that he knew not to move the things after dark. I asked whose things they were. He looked toward the back office, as if checking whether someone might hear him. Then he said, "A guest who never left properly." That sounded like motel folklore. I told him so. Dennis shrugged. "Most motel folklore starts because somebody working nights gets bored." "And this?" "This started before I worked here." He would not say more. I went back to my room. The shirt was still outside. Before going in, I crouched and looked at the collar. A laundry mark had been written inside in faded blue ink. J.V. Those 2 letters stayed with me. At 11 the next morning, the shirt was gone. On the 3rd night, nothing appeared. On the 4th, there was a brown leather belt coiled carefully beside the ice machine. On the 5th, I found a shaving brush on the hood of my work truck. Each object was dry. Each looked old without looking ruined, and every one of them contained a small amount of pale beach sand. Dennis refused to touch any of it. He told me I should do the same. I pointed out that I had already picked up the shoe. His expression tightened. "That may be why they're showing up near you." I asked what he meant. He said he didn't know. Then he poured coffee into a paper cup and gave it to me without asking. The Harbor Light had changed owners several times. Dennis had started there in 2003, when the motel still had green carpet in the office and brass keys instead of plastic cards. The first time he saw one of the objects was in 2005. A brown wool jacket appeared outside room 6 shortly after 3 in the morning. He assumed a guest had dropped it. He hung it behind the desk. 10 minutes later, the jacket was gone. He thought someone had taken it. At 3:20, he walked outside and found the same jacket hanging from the railing in front of room 6. The guest in 6 was asleep. Dennis tried again. He put the jacket in the office closet and locked the door. When he checked 15 minutes later, the closet was still locked. The jacket was no longer inside. It had returned to the railing. The next morning, the motel owner saw it and went quiet. Dennis asked why. The owner said the jacket belonged to a man named Jonah Vale. That was the first time I heard the name. Jonah Vale had stayed at the Harbor Light in the spring of 1998. He was 37, according to Dennis. He worked on a fishing boat out of Newport and had come north looking for seasonal work after an injury kept him off his usual boat. He rented room 9 for a week. Then another week. Then a third. The night he disappeared, he told the clerk he would be leaving before dawn. He asked for his bill around midnight. The clerk printed it. Jonah paid cash. But he did not return his key. Sometime after 2, he was seen walking toward the highway, carrying nothing.
His car remained in the parking lot. His clothes remained in room 9. So did a half-packed suitcase. No one saw him again. I asked if the police had been involved. Dennis said they had. The coast was searched. The beaches were checked. His family was contacted. Nothing came of it. I asked whether anyone thought he went into the ocean. Dennis looked at me for a moment. People always think the ocean when someone disappears near the coast. Do you? I think if a man plans to walk into the ocean, he probably doesn't fold his shirts first. That was the kind of answer Dennis gave when he didn't want to say what he believed. I went back to my room. The shaving brush was still on the hood of my truck. I left it there. By morning, it was gone. The 6th night was when the pattern changed. We finished early at the plant because a replacement valve arrived with the wrong flange. I was back at the motel before 1:30. The parking lot was empty, except for my truck, Dennis's old Subaru, and 6 guest cars. Nothing waited outside room 11. I was relieved. I made coffee in my room and called the supplier in Portland to leave a message about the valve. While I was speaking, I heard something scrape across the concrete outside. Not footsteps. Something heavier. I opened the door. A suitcase sat 3 feet away, dark green, hard-sided, old enough that the metal corners had dulled. A strip of brown leather had been wrapped around it, where one latch no longer closed. I knew without asking whose it was. Dennis came outside before I reached the office. He stopped halfway across the lot. "That one's new," he said. "You've never seen it?" "Not the whole case. That detail bothered me more than the suitcase itself. The shoe, the shirt, the belt, the shaving brush. Pieces. Now the container they could have belonged in." I asked what we should do. Dennis said nothing for a while. Then he told me to leave it where it was. I went inside and locked my door. At 2:10, the suitcase was still there. At 2:40, it had moved closer. I cannot tell you how. I did not see it move. But when I looked through the curtain, it was directly in front of my door. I opened the door a few inches. The suitcase stood upright. The handle was raised. There were damp grains of sand around its base. The case itself was dry. I shut the door. At 3:15, I heard one soft knock. Not on the door, from the suitcase. I did not open it. I stayed awake until daylight. At 7:20, the suitcase was gone. I told myself I was done with the whole thing. I had 4 nights left at the motel. I considered moving to a chain hotel 30 miles inland, but our crew had already paid the Harbor Light by the week, and I did not want to explain to my supervisor that I had changed hotels because old luggage was appearing outside my room. I wanted a mechanism. That evening, I asked Dennis to show me the office security cameras. The motel had 4 cameras and an old recorder that kept about 10 days. We watched the previous night. At 1:28, my truck entered the lot. At 1:31, I carried my tool bag into room 11. At 1:58, the parking lot camera flickered. Not off, just a brief roll of gray lines across the image. When the picture cleared, the suitcase was standing outside my room. No person had carried it there. Dennis replayed the section 3 times. Same result. At 2:36, the image rolled again. When it cleared, the suitcase had moved closer to my door. At 3:14, the camera image stayed normal. Nothing moved. But the audio channel, which neither of us knew the camera had, picked up a faint sound. One knock. Dennis sat back. He copied the video to a flash drive. We checked the rear camera. At 3:22, a man walked along the far edge of the frame. Only his lower body was visible because the camera angle cut off above the waist. Dark trousers, black shoes. He passed from left to right. The rear walkway ended at a locked maintenance gate. No one appeared coming back. Dennis and I went outside. The gate was still locked. Beyond it was a narrow strip of weeds, then a drainage ditch and a stand of shore pine. The wet ground showed no clear footprints, but against the bottom rail of the gate lay a thin line of pale sand. The nearest beach access was almost a mile away. That afternoon, I drove there before work. The beach was broad and gray under a low sky. The wet sand near the water was dark. The grains from the suitcase were finer and almost white. I brought a small sample back in a plastic parts bag. Dennis took one look at it and opened a drawer beneath the front counter. Inside was another bag, same color. He said it had been collected from Jonah Vale's room after he disappeared. The original bag had gone to the sheriff's office in 1998. The one in the drawer had appeared years later while the owner was cleaning the office. A label had been taped to it. Room 9, Jonah Vale. The handwriting belonged to the clerk who worked the night Jonah vanished. That clerk had died in 2001. I stopped trying to find an ordinary explanation after that. But I still wanted to understand the rule. The objects did not appear randomly. They were building towards something. A man's belongings, one piece at a time. Then the suitcase. The next night, the suitcase returned. This time it was open. It sat outside room 11, with the lid raised toward the wall. Inside were the shoe, the white shirt, the belt, and the shaving brush. There were also things I had not seen before. 2 pairs of socks, a paperback mystery novel swollen slightly from age, a small bottle of aspirin, a folded road map of Oregon, and a sealed envelope. The envelope was yellowed at the edges. On the front, in blue ink, someone had written one name: Evan Vale. No address. Dennis knew the name, Jonah's younger brother. The old owner had spoken with him after Jonah disappeared. Dennis remembered because Evan called the motel every year for a while, always around the same week in April. He would ask whether anything new had been found. The answer was always no. Eventually the calls stopped. I did not touch the envelope. Then the wind picked up. The envelope lifted from the suitcase and stopped against my boot. I stared down at it. There was a phone number written on the back. Not an old one, a modern 10-digit number in black ink. Dennis swore it had not been there before. I picked up the envelope. The paper felt warm. That is a small detail, but I remember it clearly. Everything else outside was cold and damp. The envelope was warm, as if someone had been carrying it inside a jacket. Dennis said calling the number was my decision. "You touched the shoe," he said. I carried the envelope into my room. I did not open it. Instead, I searched the name online. There were several Evan Vales in Oregon. One was listed in Salem, another in Eugene, a third in Idaho. I called none of them. The black number on the envelope waited on the nightstand. At 2:40, the suitcase was gone. The envelope remained. At 3:14, there was one knock on my door. I opened it. No suitcase. No one outside. Only pale sand on the concrete. It formed a narrow line, pointing from my room toward the parking lot. Then the line continued between 2 cars and toward the highway. Not footprints, just sand. I did not follow it. I sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope in my hand. I thought about Owen. Our last conversation had ended with me saying, "Fine, do whatever you want." Those were ordinary words. People say them every day. But there are sentences that become doors if you leave them closed long enough. I had told myself Owen could call too. Maybe he told himself the same thing. At 3:28, I dialed the number on the envelope. A man answered on the 6th ring. I asked for Evan Vale. After a pause, he said yes. I told him where I was calling from. "Is this about Jonah?" he asked. I looked at the envelope. I asked how he knew. Because nobody calls me from that place for any other reason. Evan was 62. He lived outside Salem. He had not spoken with anyone from the Harbor Light in almost 8 years. I told him about the envelope. He asked me to describe the handwriting. I did. He breathed out slowly. "That sounds like him." I asked if Jonah had ever written him a letter. "Not one I received." There was something in his voice that made me stop asking questions. Finally, he said, "We had a fight before he disappeared." He would not tell me what the fight was about. He did not need to. I asked what he wanted me to do with the envelope. "Mail it." "Without opening it?" "Yes." I asked if he was sure. "Please." He gave me an address. I wrote it on a Motel notepad. Before we hung up, Evan asked one more question. "Is the suitcase there?" I looked toward the door. "No." "It will be." He said that as if he had seen it before. I asked what he meant. Evan told me something Dennis had not known. In 2000, 2 years after Jonah disappeared, a green suitcase arrived on Evan's porch. No return address. The same one Jonah had taken to the Harbor Light. Evan recognized the leather strap. He opened it. Empty. He kept it in his garage for 6 months. One morning it was gone. He never reported it, because he had no way to explain why an old suitcase disappearing from a garage mattered. Years later, when he called the motel, the owner told him pieces of Jonah's clothing sometimes appeared on the property. Evan stopped calling after that. "I thought maybe he was trying to pack," he said. "For what?" "I don't know." His voice became quieter. "Maybe to leave." At 4:10, the suitcase was back outside my door, closed. The envelope was still in my hand. That was when I understood what I had gotten wrong. I had thought the objects were returning because Jonah could not leave the motel. That was not quite right. The objects were being gathered. The shoe, the shirt, the belt, the brush, the suitcase, then the letter. It was not a haunting that kept pulling him back. It looked more like a checkout that had never been completed. I went to the office and told Dennis. He listened without interrupting. Then he opened the old key cabinet behind the desk. Most of the hooks were empty because the motel used cards now. One brass key remained. A round metal tag hung from it. 9. Dennis said the key had been found in the parking lot in 1998, 3 days after Jonah disappeared. It had never been given to police because the owner assumed it was a spare. I asked why it was still there. "Same reason people keep things they don't know how to throw away." He gave me the key. It was heavier than I expected. At 4:23, I carried the suitcase, the envelope, and the key to the lobby. I put the key on the counter. Dennis pulled an old blank receipt from beneath the register. Not a computer printout. The kind with carbon paper between yellow and white sheets. He wrote, "Jonah Vale, room 9." Then he stopped at the line marked checkout. "What time?" he asked. I looked at the clock. 4:25. He wrote it. We both waited. Nothing happened. The suitcase remained beside me. The key remained on the counter. I felt foolish. Then Dennis pointed at the envelope. "You still have the last thing." I asked what he meant. "Guest isn't checked out if you're still holding his property." So we drove to the post office. The post office was closed, but a blue collection box stood outside. I drove there alone. The suitcase sat upright on the passenger seat. I had intended to leave it in the office. At the post office, I addressed the envelope to Evan Vale. I dropped the addressed letter through the slot. For a second, nothing changed. Then the suitcase latch beside me clicked. Once. I opened the passenger door. The suitcase was empty. No shirt, no belt, no book, no aspirin, no sand, just faded green lining. I carried it back to the motel. Dennis was standing outside the office. I placed the empty case on the concrete. "Now what?" He looked at the key on the counter inside. "Maybe now we stop helping." That was the difficult part. Everything in me wanted to do one more thing. Drive the suitcase to the beach. Burn it. Lock it away. Give it to Evan. Find out where Jonah had gone. Machines teach you to keep working until the system runs correctly. But people are not refrigeration systems. Some problems get worse because you cannot stop touching them. So we left the suitcase where it was. I went to bed. When I woke at noon, it was gone. The brass key to room 9 was gone too. Dennis had not moved either one. The handwritten checkout receipt remained. 4:25 in the morning. For the rest of my stay, nothing appeared outside room 11. No shoe, no shirt, no sand, no suitcase. I finished the compressor job and left the coast the following Monday. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of Jonah Vale's letter. Evan had written one sentence across the top. "I thought you should know what you helped deliver." I read it once, then again. Jonah's letter was not dramatic. He apologized for the fight with his brother. He admitted he had said things he did not mean. He wrote that he kept waiting for Evan to call first, then realized Evan was probably waiting for the same thing. The last line was simple. "I don't want our last conversation to be the last thing between us." Jonah had written the date beneath it. April 17th, 1998. The night he disappeared. I called Owen. He answered with, "What do you want?" I almost hung up. Instead, I told him I had been wrong about the house. He said he had been wrong too. We sat in silence for a while. It was enough to keep the line open. We talk now. Not every week, not about everything, but we talk. I never learned what happened to Jonah Vale. Evan wrote to me once more. The envelope I mailed reached him 2 days after I sent it. Inside was Jonah's original letter. Also inside was a small brass motel key. Round metal tag. 9. I had left that key on the counter at the harbor light. Evan mailed it back to the motel. Dennis called me after it arrived. He asked what I thought they should do. I told him to put it somewhere no guest would touch it. Dennis laughed. "Like where?" I had no answer. The harbor light closed in 2019 after storm damage made the west wing too expensive to repair. I heard Dennis moved inland. I have not spoken with him in years. But I still drive that part of the coast for work sometimes. The old motel building is there, fenced off now, its sign removed,
and several windows covered with plywood.
I do not stop. The last time I passed, it was just after 3 in the morning. Rain moved through the headlights. For a moment, as I drove past the old entrance, I saw something standing beside the locked gate. A dark green suitcase, upright, handle raised. The highway was empty behind me. I kept driving. In the mirror, the suitcase stayed by the gate. This time, it was facing away from the motel. The first line appeared in my handwriting while I was standing 3 feet away from the book. I know how that sounds. There was no one else behind the desk, and I had not picked up the pen. The registration ledger lay open beneath the green-shaded lamp, the same place it had been all night. One moment the bottom line was empty. The next, a name sat there in black ink. Miriam Carver, room 14. No arrival time, no checkout time. The North Shore Motor Lodge sat outside Marquette, Michigan, on an old road that curved along Lake Superior before turning inland through spruce and birch. The lake was hidden from most of the rooms by a line of trees, but on windy nights you could hear it beyond the highway. A low, continuous sound that never quite became surf. I worked the overnight desk there in November of 2009. The motel had 31 rooms, though only 26 were still rented by then. 5 rooms in the West Wing had been closed because the owner, Gordon Price, said the plumbing repairs would cost more than a winter's business. We had electronic keys, a computer reservation system, and a card reader that worked most of the time. We also had the ledger. Gordon's father had started it in 1968. The book on the desk was only the latest volume, but he insisted every overnight clerk write each arrival by hand, even after the computer took over. Name, room, arrival time, checkout time, payment method. He said paper never crashed. I thought it was an old man's habit that had outlived the old man. I was 39 then, and had recently moved back north after my mother died. I grew up outside Escanaba, left Michigan in my 20s, and spent 14 years in Milwaukee doing warehouse inventory. When my marriage ended, I came home because there was nowhere else I particularly wanted to be. Night work suited me. At 2 in the morning, nobody expected you to be cheerful. The line in the ledger appeared at 2:27. Miriam Carver, room 14. The handwriting was mine. Not similar to mine. Mine. I make capital M's with the first stroke too long. My 4s are open at the top. I press harder on the downstroke of a V than I do on the rest of the word. The name had all of it. I checked the computer. Room 14 was vacant. I checked the wooden backup rack beneath the desk. No card in 14. I walked down the east hall and opened the room with the master key. The bed was made. The bathroom light was off. 2 plastic cups sat upside down on the sink. The heat had been left at 55, which was how housekeeping kept empty rooms in cold weather. Nothing looked touched. I returned to the lobby and stared at the ledger again. The name was still there. I decided I had written it and forgotten. That explanation lasted 9 minutes. At 2:36, headlights moved across the front windows. A blue Buick pulled beneath the awning. The woman who came inside was probably in her late 50s. She wore a dark green coat and carried a small canvas overnight bag. Her hair was silver at the temples and wet from sleet. She put one hand on the counter. "Do you have anything on the first floor?" I looked at the ledger before I answered. Then I asked her name. "Miriam Carver." I did not say anything for a few seconds. She noticed. "Something wrong?" I asked whether she had a reservation. She said no. She had been driving from Duluth toward Sault Ste. Marie, but the weather had gotten worse east of town. She wanted one night and planned to leave after breakfast. I asked if she had ever stayed at the North Shore before. She looked around the lobby. I don't think so. That was not the answer I wanted.
I gave her room 14. There were other rooms available, but the line in the book already had 14 beside her name. I wanted to know whether anything else would match. She signed the printed registration slip. Her signature looked nothing like the name in the ledger. The ledger entry was in my handwriting. I wrote her arrival time beside it, 2:41. The moment my pen left the paper, the ink darkened. I mean the entire line. The name, room number, and arrival time all became a shade darker than the surrounding entries, as if they had been written with a wetter pen. Miriam saw it. What did it do? I told her the ink had spread. She leaned over the counter. Then her face changed. Not fear. Recognition. Where did you get that book? I asked what she meant. She pointed at her name. You wrote that before I came in, didn't you? I did not answer. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with driving. Of course you did. She picked up her room key. I asked her to wait. She said she had been waiting long enough. Then she went down the hall. I followed as far as the ice machine. Miriam. She stopped. How did you know? She kept her back to me. For a few seconds, only the ice machine compressor made noise. Then she said, Because this isn't the first book. Room 14 had a small table beneath the window and 2 wooden chairs that never matched. Miriam sat in one while I stood near the door. She told me the first time she knew it had happened was in 1993. She was driving through western Wisconsin with her husband, Paul. They stopped at a motel outside Eau Claire after midnight. The clerk looked at her strangely when she gave her name. Her name was already in the guest register, written in the clerk's handwriting. Room 8. They laughed about it. The clerk blamed fatigue. Miriam and Paul stayed one night and left after breakfast. 2 years later, it happened again in Indiana, then in Ohio, then northern Illinois. Not every trip, not every motel. Only older roadside places that still kept handwritten registration books. Sometimes her name appeared before she arrived. Sometimes the clerk found it afterward and called the phone number from her registration card. At first, she thought someone was following her. Then Paul died in 2001. The entries continued. She stopped taking road trips for several years. When she traveled again, the books were waiting. Always your name? I asked. She nodded. Always in the clerk's handwriting? Yes. Same room number? No. Same date? No. What happens after you leave? She looked at me. That depends on whether they write the time. I asked what time. The checkout. That was the part she had not understood for years. At most motels, the clerk or owner eventually wrote a checkout time beside her name. When that happened, the line behaved like every other entry. Nothing else occurred. But 3 times, nobody filled it in. The first was in Ohio. The motel called her house 2 days later and asked whether she had left. She told them she had. The owner said her room was empty, the key had been returned, and housekeeping had cleaned it. But the ledger still showed her checked in. The computer did not. Only the paper. The second time was in Illinois. The night clerk refused to write a checkout time after Miriam left because he thought the whole thing was a prank. For 4 nights, room 19 could not be rented. Not because the key failed,
or the computer showed occupied, guests simply would not stay. 3 different people entered the room and came back to the desk within minutes, saying someone else was already inside. Nobody could describe the person. The owner finally wrote a checkout time from memory. The complaints stopped. The 3rd time was the one that made Miriam afraid of the books. It happened in 2006 at a motel outside Toledo. She checked out at 6 in the morning. The desk clerk watched her return the key. He watched her drive away. He forgot to write the time. That afternoon, Miriam stopped at a gas station in Pennsylvania. When she opened her wallet, the motel key was inside. A brass key with a red plastic tag. Room 23. She called the motel. The clerk said room 23 was still occupied. Miriam told him she was 200 miles away. He asked her to hold. Then another man came on the phone. The owner. He said he had just opened room 23 with the master key. The room was empty, but the bed was warm. I asked what happened next. The owner wrote 612 in the book. And the key? It was gone from my wallet. She said it quietly. I did not know whether I believed her, but I believed the name that had appeared under my hand. Miriam looked toward the motel door. I should leave before daylight. I asked why. Because if the book wants a checkout, daylight seems to make it impatient. That sentence sounded ridiculous. I wrote it down anyway. Not in the ledger, on a motel notepad. At 3:15, I called Gordon. He lived in a house behind the property and answered, sounding annoyed. I told him we had a problem with the old guest book. That changed his voice. What kind of problem? I asked if he had ever seen a name appear before a guest arrived. He did not answer. I repeated the question. Finally, he said, What name? Miriam Carver. There was a long silence. Then Gordon told me to come to the office closet. He arrived wearing boots, jeans, and a parka over his pajamas. Without speaking, he unlocked a metal cabinet at the back of the closet. Inside were 12 old ledgers. The oldest had a cracked brown cover and smelled like paper that had spent years near damp concrete. Gordon pulled out one from 1986. He opened it to a page marked with a folded receipt. There were 6 ordinary names, then one line in darker ink. Miriam Carver, room 6, no checkout time. The handwriting belonged to Gordon's father. I stared at the date. November 17th, 1986. Miriam would have been in her 30s. I asked Gordon if she had stayed there. He shook his head. Not that year. I looked at him. He turned the page. Another entry. 1990. Miriam Carver, room 21. No checkout time. Did she stay then? No. How do you know? Because my father wrote notes. In the back of the ledger, on a blank page, Gordon's father had written, Woman never arrived. Name appeared after midnight. Do not assign room 21 until wine clears. Below that, lying gone at 6:43. I asked what made it clear. Gordon said his father never explained. He pulled another ledger. 1997. Miriam Carver, room 14. Arrival blank. Checkout blank. At the bottom of the page, someone had written in pencil, Saw blue car pass entrance at 5:10. Did not stop. Gordon looked toward the lobby. Your guest is in 14. I nodded. He swore softly. I asked why. Because 14 is the only room her name ever came back to. I did not understand. He showed me another entry from 2003.
Miriam Carver, room 14. No arrival, no checkout. Then 2006, same thing. She had never stayed at the North Shore on any of those nights. But her name had appeared.
Gordon's father had a rule. If Miriam Carver's name appeared beside room 14 and she did not arrive, nobody rented 14 until sunrise. If she did arrive, the clerk was supposed to write the checkout time while she was physically standing at the desk. Not before, not after, while she was there. I asked why. Gordon said, "I was hoping you could tell me." We went to room 14. Miriam opened the door before we knocked. She had packed her bag. When she saw Gordon carrying the old ledger, she sat down on the bed. "You have more than one?" Gordon asked if she remembered staying there. She said no. He showed her the entries. 1986, 1990, 1997, 2003, 2006. Her face became very still. Then she touched the 1986 line. "My husband and I were in Detroit that week." Gordon asked if she was sure. "Yes." The next line was 1990. She looked at the date. "We were home. Paul had pneumonia." 1997. "We were in Arizona." 2003. "I didn't travel that year." 2006. She said nothing. I asked where she had been. At the motel in Toledo, the one where the key had followed her. The dates matched. That changed the shape of the problem. The North Shore ledger had recorded Miriam on nights when something had gone wrong with her checkout somewhere else. Not every time, but enough. Room 14 seemed less like a prediction, more like an overflow. A place the unfinished line went when another book failed to close it. Gordon did not like that idea. Neither did I. At 4:12, we heard a faint scratching from the lobby. Not footsteps, not the heater. The dry, deliberate sound of a pen moving across paper. We went back to the desk. The ledger lay open under the green lamp. A new line had appeared beneath Miriam's. Same black ink. The room number was in my handwriting. The guest name was not. Paul Carver, room 14. No arrival time. No checkout time. Miriam sat down in the lobby chair. For the first time that night, she looked frightened. "My husband never stayed here." Gordon asked when Paul died. 8 years ago. I stared at his name. Then I noticed something else. The handwriting was not exactly mine anymore. The capital P leaned differently. The lowercase a closed more tightly. Miriam leaned over the book. She touched the line without touching the ink. "That's his." I asked, "Whose?" "Paul's." She said her husband had written birthday cards with a heavy right slant. His V had a sharp bottom and a long final stroke. The name on the page had both. The room number was still in my handwriting, 14. The guest name was Paul's. That was the first moment I considered closing the book. Not filling the line. Not testing it. Closing it and putting it away. Gordon stopped me. "My father tried that once." He showed me a scar along the bottom edge of the cover. In 1990, his father had shut the ledger after Miriam's name appeared. He locked it in the office safe. At 5 the next morning, every guest door in the East Wing was standing open. Nobody had opened them. No one was missing. But every room key had been placed on the front counter. The ledger was still locked in the safe. When his father opened it, Miriam's line had moved from room 21 to room 14. He wrote a checkout time. The doors stayed closed after that.
Miriam asked what time he wrote. Gordon checked the note. 6:43. The same minute the line had cleared in the other ledger. I looked at the wall clock. 4:28. Miriam said Paul's name had never appeared before. That mattered to her more than her own. She asked if we could call the number she still had for their old house. It had been disconnected for years. We tried anyway. No service. She gave me her daughter's number in Green Bay. Her daughter answered on the third ring. Miriam said, "It's Mom." There was a pause. Then a woman said, "Are you okay?" Miriam smiled a little. She asked whether her father had ever stayed at a motel near Marquette. Her daughter said she did not think so. Then she remembered something. When Paul was dying, he talked about a motel room. Not a real trip, a dream. He kept saying he had left something in room 14. Miriam's smile disappeared. "What?" Her daughter did not know. Paul never explained. He died 2 days later. Miriam thanked her and hung up. Nobody spoke. At 4:50, Paul's line changed. A checkout time appeared. 5:17. We all watched it form. No hand touched the page. The numbers wrote themselves slowly, one stroke at a time. 5:17. Miriam's line remained blank. Gordon whispered, "That has never happened." I asked what happened at 5:17. No one knew. Miriam stood. "I'm going to the room." I told her not to. She looked at me. "If he left something there, I want to know what." That was the choice forming in front of us. We could keep her in the lobby and wait for daylight. Or we could go to 14 before the time written beside Paul's name. Gordon wanted to wait. I understood why. I also understood Miriam. 8 years is a long time to live with the last version of a person you were given. Sometimes one small, unanswered thing becomes larger than it deserves because it is the only thing left that can still change. At 5:02, the three of us walked back to room 14. Nothing looked different. 2 beds, brown carpet, a framed photograph of Lake Superior in winter, a heater beneath the window. Miriam stood in the center of the room. "What did he leave?" No one answered. At 5:10, the heater shut off. The room became quiet. At 5:12, the bathroom light came on. At 5:13, the door to the connecting room opened. Room 15 had been empty all night. I had checked it myself. The connecting door was normally locked from both sides. Now it stood open, 3 inches. Gordon moved toward it. Miriam stopped him. "Wait." A man coughed on the other side. One soft cough. Miriam closed her eyes. That was him. I did not ask how she knew. The door opened another inch. Through the gap I could see room 15. At least, I thought I could. The carpet was different. Blue instead of brown. The bedspread had a floral pattern I had only seen in old photographs of the motel. A suitcase sat on the luggage rack. Brown leather. A man's coat hung from the back of a chair. The room looked like another decade. Gordon whispered, "We remodeled in 94. The wall clock beside the bed said 5:16. Our clock said 5:16. Miriam stepped toward the doorway. I caught her arm. She did not pull away. From room 15, a man said, "Miriam?" Her knees nearly gave. She covered her mouth. The voice came again, older, weak. "Did we miss checkout?" Miriam began crying without making a sound.
I told Paul, or the voice that sounded like Paul, to stay where he was. He laughed softly. "That's what the clerk said." The clock changed. 5:17. The ledger in the lobby slammed shut. We heard it from down the hall. At the same moment, Paul's room changed. The blue carpet darkened. The floral bedspread disappeared. The suitcase was gone. For 1 second, a man stood beside the chair. Grey hair, thin shoulders, hospital bracelet around one wrist. He looked at Miriam. Then the connecting door swung closed. No bang, just the soft click of the latch. Miriam leaned against the wall. Gordon unlocked room 15 from the hall. It was empty. Brown carpet, modern bedspread. No suitcase. No coat. No man. On the nightstand lay a folded piece of paper. Miriam picked it up. It was a motel receipt. North Shore Motor Lodge. November 17th, 1986. Room 14.
Paul Carver. One night. Paid cash. Checkout time, 5:17. The receipt was older than the printer we had in the lobby. Gordon said the motel did not use that form anymore. Miriam turned it over. On the back, in blue ink, were 5 words. "You went home without me." She read them once. Then she sat on the bed. I did not ask whether it was Paul's handwriting. Her face answered that. We returned to the lobby. The ledger was open again. Paul's line was gone. Not crossed out. Gone. Miriam's line remained. Miriam Carver, room 14. Arrival, 2:41. Checkout, blank. The wall clock said 5:29. Daylight was beginning to lighten the windows. Miriam put her room key on the desk. Then she looked at me. "You have to write it while I'm here." I picked up the pen. My hand shook enough that I had to set it down once. "What time?" She looked at the clock. 5:30. I wrote 5:30 in the checkout column. The ink stayed black. Nothing moved. Nothing rang. Nothing changed. Miriam waited. So did we. Then she took the receipt from 1986, folded it, and put it inside her coat. She picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. "Do I take the key?" I looked at Gordon. He shook his head. "You checked out," he said. Miriam left the key on the counter. She walked to the blue Buick. The engine started. She backed beneath the awning and lowered the window. For a moment I thought she might say something. She only raised one hand. Then she drove east. We watched until the taillights disappeared around the curve. I went back to the book. Her line was still there. Name, room, arrival, checkout, complete. Gordon exhaled. "I think that's it." It almost was. At 6:12, I closed the ledger. At 6:13, something scratched inside the cover. I opened it again. On the next empty line, in handwriting that was not mine, was one sentence. "Thank you for keeping the desk open." No name, no room, no time. Gordon read it. He sat down. Neither of us spoke for a while. The North Shore Motor Lodge closed in 2015. Gordon sold the property to a developer who tore down the west wing and turned the lobby into part of a small apartment complex. I left night work before that. I moved to Green Bay, then back to Michigan again. I never saw Miriam Carver after that morning. I searched her name once or twice and found nothing I could trust. Gordon kept the old ledgers. After he died, his daughter called me because he had left a box with my name on it. Inside were 6 of the books. The 2009 ledger was on top. I opened it to Miriam's page. Her line was still complete. Miriam Carver, room 14, arrival 2:41, checkout 5:30. Paul's line was not there. Neither was the sentence thanking me. For a while, I thought that was better. Then I noticed the final page. There was one entry. No date, no guest name. Room 14, arrival blank, checkout blank. The room number was written in my handwriting. I had not written it. The old motel has been gone for years. There is no room 14 anymore. But every November, when sleet starts tapping against the windows and the lake goes dark before dinner, I take that ledger out of the box. I open it to the final page. So far, the line is still waiting.